Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox-Bolton of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals, to state senators, to mayors, to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. Today, I talked to a New Dealer from New Hampshire, New Hampshire Senator Rebecca Perkins Kwoka. She was elected to the New Hampshire State Senate in 2020 and previously served 2 terms on the Portsmouth City Council. Her election to the New Hampshire Senate broke barriers as she's the first LGBTQ woman to serve in the legislature. Senator Rebecca Perkins Kwoka, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thank you, Ryan. I am thrilled to be here with you.
There's so much to talk about. There's a lot going on in New Hampshire, but I want to start because it's summertime, and one of the things I associate with summer is Dairy Queen. And I know you grew up working in your family's Dairy Queen, and I wondered if you could tell us some stories of what that was like and how it's informed your approach to supporting small businesses in your state.
Yeah, definitely. I always like talking about Dairy Queen since I spent so much time there. It actually was a pretty big influence on, I would say, ending up involved in politics. And, from an early age, I think I just sort of came to understand in a very personal way that, life wasn't the same for each of us. And though I was lucky enough to be born into a family that, didn't have a lot of means, we were making do owning a business. Some of my employees and friends who were of a similar age, might have had very different circumstances. They might have had absent parents or parents with a substance use disorder or just sort of a different circumstance that was going to make life different for them. And so I think, just being exposed to that inherent sort of understanding that we didn't all start on the same starting line really has sort of informed a lot of what I've gone through as I've gone through my life, and sort of making sure that people understand that we all want to work hard and we all want to do our best, but we don't all get to start in the same place.
And certainly, businesses, small restaurants have been deeply affected by COVID. What have you been doing over the last 16 months to try to support, the kinds of businesses that you grew up in?
Well, we've been doing that in big and small ways. We certainly are aware as a family of what they're going through as owners, and also what their employees are going through in terms of uncertainty. But so we've tried to support them by being customers and friends. But I've also spent a lot of time with some of the business owners in our community. And here in the seacoast of New Hampshire, we have a really lovely sort of small business community, and a lot of those owners were already friends. But even in cases where they weren't, I've spent a lot of time reaching out to business owners in my district and, primarily listening. I wanted to understand what the federal and state aid programs that rolled out had helped. I wanted to understand where there were gaps. And then as a senator who won my election in November, I actually brought legislation to address what I saw as the biggest gap there, which was that businesses formed after May 26, 2019 in our state had actually not had access really to any program due to how new they were and the fact that they didn't have 2019 full financial records to sort of verify loss. And so some of our very newest businesses, which are the businesses which create the most jobs, they are filling the most recent niches in our economy and often are opening at a time that's later than they wanted to in the first place, were being left out of the aid programs that our state was offering. And so I brought a bill to make sure that any future federal discretionary funds, however they were allocated by our state, would definitely include this group of newer businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. You saw this with the independent contractors, and you saw it with the sole proprietorships. Really, sort of fell through the cracks, and it was difficult to align, these big federal programs with so many different individual needs. But I agree, supporting those brand new businesses who are just opening up and trying to make it work it's already difficult to start a business and to start one, certainly in the middle of a pandemic and economic crisis. We needed to help them as much as we could.
Yeah, I was so struck by, in interviewing them again and again, how much it was their will to survive, that kept their business alive. And so many of them, just being a business owner and starting their business in the first place, had been such a major undertaking. If they were open, they felt like they had to start all over, whether that's because of new business models or figuring out new aid or getting outdoor seating permits or whatever it was that, sort of was their challenge coming into the pandemic. But in addition to that, businesses that just happened to open a little later still had invested, tens or potentially more thousands of dollars in their business, had been through permitting, had been through financing. And so all of them are creative and hardworking, and, they deserve a helping hand from those of us that can do it.
One of the things on your very impressive resume, you grew up in New Hampshire, went to Dartmouth for undergrad, Cornell for law school. You were in the Peace Corps and you did small business development in West Africa. And I'm wondering if any of the skills or lessons you learned from that experience helped support the small businesses back in your home state.
Yeah, probably a little bit. We all draw things from our various experiences, But yeah, I was fortunate enough to serve in West Africa for almost 2.5 years, and it's a very different place on this earth than Seacoast, New Hampshire. But it was a wonderful experience. You're completely immersed in a community. As a Peace Corps volunteer, I lived my life in 3 different languages. One of them was the local language, which was Wolof, and primarily found myself working with women and high schoolers who, didn't necessarily have a lot of formal options in the economy. Getting a salaried job or even an hourly job in sort of unbanked economies is a pretty big challenge. So the question was sort of how to make something virtually out of nothing in almost all of their cases. And so whether that was as a high schooler, being a student of a vocation such as sewing or metalworking or something that, they could sort of start a business in, or for women, similarly, was there something they could cook? Was there something they could sell that would generate some cash flow to support their family? And so it was micro-entrepreneurism. And I think, we see examples of that in the way you start a business in America. There are obviously differences and similarities. I think, for example, there's not as much permitting in West Africa. There's not as much financing in West Africa, but the principles remain the same. What's working, what's not working? How do you get the word out to the people that need your service? And how can you sort of use the money that comes in the smartest way? And that was certainly a question I think a lot of our businesses were asking during the pandemic. Okay, if I have this limited resource, do I spend it on payroll? Do I spend it on equipment? Do I spend it on upgrades while we're closed? Do I hold on to it? Do I pay myself? And I think they were asking a lot of those questions due to sort of extreme circumstances, but they're questions that business owners face all the time. Certainly some comparisons, although, definitely some differences too.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to return to New Hampshire, and then where you think this commitment to public service that you so evidently have comes from, and what that path has been like for you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions in there, but for me, I always wanted to come back, and I've always felt fortunate that I grew up in a place that I wanted to come back to. I think it has struck me as I've grown up and moved around the world, I guess, really, that, figuring out sort of like where to build life is complex these days and not always obvious. So I've always felt lucky to have that in New Hampshire, and I've always felt sort of a deep commitment to my state. And I think part of the sense of duty is just a recognition that when I was growing up, we weren't able to do everything on our own. I mean, I grew up as part of a big Italian family, whether they helped my mom with childcare or help on the weekends with our small business or whatever it was, there were always people present. When I went to college, I certainly did that with the help of a bunch of scholarship funds. Often when I had questions or challenges, I had mentors or other folks involved in my life to just sort of help me through it. And so I think just feeling that connection to community, I just feel a conviction that it's our responsibility, to be a part of our society. And whether you do that for a year as a member of a planning board or, as a member of a school board, or you do it for multiple years and you run campaigns, however you do it, I think it's just really important to recognize that, our democracy doesn't function on its own. It takes people to run it and people to be involved in it. And I think, making sure that that's a part of your life and that you're also modeling that for your children, I think is really important. So it's been wonderful to be back in New Hampshire. There's so many young people our age and young parents and young working folks that, we really feel like we've been able to build a really genuine community here. And so I wouldn't go anywhere else. I love it.
Can I actually just dive into that a little bit? Because one of the things that we've seen in this pandemic is folks like you and me who grew up in smaller towns and maybe left to go to college or grad school, went to urban cities and post-pandemic are reconsidering life and looking at maybe returning to their hometowns or similar small towns. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to go and come back and engage your community in this new way, getting elected to city council and then eventually to the state senate?
Yeah, I think it's really rewarding, and I can understand how it's hard to know whether that's the right decision for someone or not. But in my case, you can be in New York and you can be in DC, and there are other things you can impact there. And I know when I came home from DC to New Hampshire, there were opportunities I was looking at in both places. But ultimately, your home state needs you, and it needs the new ideas you've acquired from being somewhere else, and needs you to be part of the next generation and help shape what's going on back home. And, it's unquestionably been my experience that it makes a difference for this generation to be here. And maybe that's only true in New Hampshire, but I somehow doubt that, because we're just, we're native to a new economy. We're native to a sharing economy. We're native to a digital economy. We're native to a work from home economy. There are things that we understand about how the world is changing that are intuitive to us and help us as policymakers to think long term about how that might further evolve. That's part of the mix that will help make good policy for all of our places going forward. And I think without us there, we're leaving decisions that will affect us the most up to other people. We are going to be a part of our states and our communities the longest. We will be here for many, many more years, and so shaping how that future unfolds, I just think is super important. And so I just feel like being home, you have a better ability to make that impact. Maybe it's not in a huge city, or maybe it's not on a really grand scale, but you're still making that impact, and it's still important. And every piece of our country is important, as we've learned from recent elections, to make sure that we're just sort of staying abreast of best practices and thinking ahead, because we don't want to see any of these places kind of wither or be lost. And I think without recognizing that, we need to be here to help with that. We just can't be a part of that solution.
You obviously play a critical role in bringing a fresh voice to your state. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that you were the first LGBTQ senator in your state's history. Can you talk about how you try to bring a perspective and values to the state Senate and to your state in general?
Sure. I think it's another big question, but yeah, and I always like to acknowledge, as far as I know, I'm the first openly LGBTQ woman to serve in our state Senate, because there may have been predecessors of mine that were just not out. But yeah, I think that my experience has always been that I'm most comfortable communicating from a position of respect, but strength, and I think acknowledging the contributions of everyone who's come before us is always an important part of communicating, but yet, we do have a lot to add as young people, and our generation is one of the most civic generations I think there has been in a long time. We are extremely well informed, we're extremely engaged, and, we want to make a difference. And so bringing that voice to the table, in my opinion, is a no-brainer. I mean, it's an addition and it helps our country. So I feel confident in that, and I feel sure that it's something we should be doing. And so then, I think it becomes a question of, making sure you own that, making sure that you are informed on the topics you're going to talk about, that you do your research, that you have a team around you. And believe me, your team is more important than you could ever imagine, but you're not ever doing this alone. Making sure that your team around you is there to help you iron out details, figure out inaccuracies, reword something, bounce something off of them, make sure that you kind of have that environment where, you can sort of enable yourself to be constantly communicating in a very accurate and professional manner, and I think you also have to engage people who have different strengths than you, right? I mean, I'm not I'm not a natural sort of marketer. I mean to post things on social media much more often than I do, and so part of being a senator has been, I got an intern because I thought that would help me do my job better. It would help me put my voice out there better, and that wasn't something that senators did previously, but I had this great member of my campaign team that I wanted to keep working with, and it's been a great arrangement. So I think you just have to kind of do what works for you, acknowledging that at 38 years old, I'm not retired, I'm general counsel of a renewable energy company. I have a young daughter. I'm pregnant. There's a lot going on in my life that is going to take away from my ability to necessarily communicate and be in the debate, unless I can sort of figure out a way to use the tools around me to do that. And I think you do that. You kind of have to evolve into it, but it's a big important part of the job, and I think you kind of have to just set yourself up so that you can do it effectively.
And one of the places where you've been vocal and a real leader is talking about issues around women's health care and reproductive rights. And we're obviously in a changing moment in our history with potential changes coming from the Supreme Court in this area. What are the challenges that you see both in New Hampshire and nationally to the continued safeguarding of both reproductive rights and maternal health care? And how do you bring your voice to that debate?
Yeah, it's so important and so fundamental to, I think, just equality of the genders, and I've spoken to so many women of the generation before me in recent weeks who are just so discouraged to hear, that we're still fighting the same fight. But the point is, we're not going to give up, and it's very fundamental to me that as women and as full members of this society, we have control over our bodies. We are complex, we're intelligent, we can understand the decisions before us. We are the best ones to make determinations about what's going to happen with our bodies and our babies, and I just think we are the ones that have to live with everything that happens, whether that's a really tragic decision, whether it's a decision to proceed and care for, children that may have challenges, whatever that is, whatever your family situation is, you're going to be the one that has that. And so just like every other decision in life, I mean, you're really in the best position to know, can your family do that? Can you do that? Can this child do that? And the idea that anyone else would be involved in that just seems fundamentally strange to me. I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's not like anyone would make those decisions without the utmost degree of care and empathy and struggle, and I think the policy that we would control women's bodies sort of implies otherwise. It implies that, we might be less than thoughtful about it. And that, I think, is just, it's not respectful of women and their complexity. So that's kind of how I approach it, and I think that we've seen so much progress on women's equality, and, I'm so proud to serve as like a young female senator in our state. But at moments like this, it just sort of demonstrates why we need young people moving back, and we need their voices in the legislature, and we need them running, because if you're not there, someone else is going to be there, and they may not hold the same views that you do. They may not say these things, and they may not fight for them. And so, you can't leave it up to somebody else. You really, if you think it's important, you need to do it. Again, even if it's not for years and years, but it's your contribution, and I think it's important.
I totally agree. And what opportunities and challenges are you sort of seeing in the legislature on these issues that you think people need to be aware of?
Well, it's become very partisan, and that's really unfortunate. And in particular in New Hampshire, that stands out because we have a long history of reproductive rights actually being a very bipartisan issue. And unfortunately, it reflects a bunch of other issues that have become increasingly partisan. And I know as a legislator participating this year, I mean, New Hampshire's always been a place for bipartisan work where you can make deals across the aisle. People know each other. There's so many legislators. I don't know if you guys would know this, but we have 414 members of our House of Representatives. So there's a lot of people involved in these decisions. And, they're part of communities together, and they might be on other sides of the aisle, but they should be able to talk. And so it's too bad to see even something like this become partisan, which of course it has been on the national stage for a long time. But again, that had not been the case in New Hampshire. And so advocates that I've worked with, at least on the reproductive rights issue, have said there have been legislators who traditionally, have been strong on this that have sort of changed how they've been voting. And, I think we've all seen nationally how partisanship has become more polarizing. And I'm sure that's another podcast for another day, but it's, in my mind, it's related to media coverage, it's related to fundraising, it's related to, sort of outside influences getting involved in state politics. So it's complex, but unfortunate in my mind.
Yeah, and I guess I'd be fascinated to hear your take. So I think like many politically active people, I've done volunteer work on campaigns for president in New Hampshire, and there are some challenges with having New Hampshire always be first or the first primary. But I also know how engaged and how bipartisan it can be. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm curious as to whether you think it's your state's just getting pulled along and polarized like the rest of the country, and what, if anything, can be done about it. It is easier in a smaller state to try to push back because people do have those relationships and expectations. But are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about sort of the future of partisanship in your state?
Yeah, it's a great question, and everything you just made reference to is so true. I mean, I have had so many people come to our state and comment on how engaged, our citizenry is in this process, and we're really proud of that. I think it's just part of a New Hampshire tradition, and you probably have heard the jokes 1,000 times. Everybody expects to meet every presidential candidate, and it's kind of the truth, and that just doesn't happen in other places. So we're lucky for that. It's hard to answer on the wake of the 2020 elections, because just as someone who was actively involved in campaigns last fall here, I mean, not being able to knock on doors it was huge, and it's a very expected part of politics here, which may not be the case everywhere. And, people aren't going to engage on the phone or via a voicemail or an email or even a social media post. That it's just not the same as having an in-person conversation. And to your point, I think those in-person conversations they're so important to breaking down what might be high level and unnuanced, partisan communication. I think it's important to kind of dig into the details of issues to create understanding. And that's where common ground is. Common ground doesn't exist when one party has 3 bullet points and the other party has 3 bullet points. Common ground exists when you spend 20 minutes talking about something, and you kind of understand that the other person is coming from a place of reason. And so I don't know, I hope we can return to those more traditional ways of campaigning in 2022. And I hope that without the pandemic as a concern, we will see more of a return to that. But it was a huge influence, I think, in how 2020 turned out here. So.
And I'll just give you briefly my story is, I'm a California kid, so I'm there in the winter, going through the snow for Al Gore, and I knocked on somebody's door, and I was pitching Al Gore, and they asked me a question, pretty obscure question about taxes, and I didn't know the answer, and their response was, "Well, have him call me," and I'm like, "The vice president?" and they were like, "Yeah, he should call me and answer the question." And I thought, wow, that is a level of engagement that's just wholly different than you see anywhere else.
That's a great story.
So I want to talk, another thing you've been vocal on and sort of ties into this very issues we're talking about is redistricting that's going on. Both the challenges with the timing and then the potential partisan nature of it. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in your state, and with every House seat being critical, and then in the state legislatures, how do you think it's going to play out in New Hampshire?
Yeah, it's been an interesting debate for sure. So I was prime sponsor of 3 bills related to redistricting, and then a colleague of mine had a 4th. And together they basically focused on having an independent redistricting commission, which traditionally was a bipartisan issue. And then in lieu of that, if that didn't actually happen, or potentially in addition, making sure that any meetings that were held were available to the public, and that any resources used were available to both parties, because there had been a little history of that not being the case, and that any maps that were proposed were promptly made available to the public for review, because unfortunately there had been some history of the maps not being available for review prior to being adopted. So the debate was interesting. I mean, to me, following, what happened with our election last year, these false allegations of fraud, the insurrection on January 6th, it was our job, every single one of us, regardless of party, to reaffirm what this democracy was, and the fact that we were going to adhere to it, in its most pure form, basically. And I think we each bore a responsibility to try to do that in every way that we could. And so independent redistricting for me is just an important piece of that. And it was, I guess, unfortunate just to see that it did break down along partisan lines. And what we heard from our colleagues across the aisle was that, these bills kind of implied that process wouldn't be fair, which, I wasn't here in 2010. I didn't see the process, but those who were here, they certainly couldn't say that they thought it was conducted in an extensive and open public manner. So, I think history kind of supports the idea that there do need to be some controls around it, and in theory they should be no issue and not partisan, because it's just the way we should be doing it. But given that the argument from the other side was sort of to say this imputed bad motives to them and sort of acted like they were going to act in bad faith, they were going to vote against it. And so, it's too bad, and I remain hopeful. We'll still be pushing this for the next decade, but obviously it's a hugely fundamental part of what will get done over the next 10 years. And so it's really too bad we couldn't make a difference on it this time around.
How do you stay motivated? I mean, obviously you have a lot going on. You have a little one and another one on the way. You have a important, difficult full-time job. How do you stay motivated to keep engaging in a political process that is increasingly frustrating and not particularly fact-based?
Yeah. I like the eloquent way you stated that. Well, I mean, I'm sure you have your answer for this question too, right? But it's important, and I put my hand up to do this, and so people are looking to you to represent them and do a good job and fight as hard as you can, and so you need to do that, But yeah, there's a lot of challenges, I think, to managing having a young family and being an elected official and all that. No small part of it is my amazing wife, who is, just a huge part of all of this, and would be a huge part of anybody, I think, who serves in elected office, being able to do their job. But at the end of the day, you have to care that much. It's not, running for office is awesome. I have loved it. I would encourage everybody to do it. But you have to pick something that's going to really light your fire, because you do. At 9 p.m., you're logging off of a Zoom. You might still have an op-ed to edit. You miss bedtime. And that's not going to be every day, but it is going to happen. And you just need to kind of know in your heart that it's important for you to be there, and it's important for you to be doing it. And if you're not there, you don't know who will do it. And that's not to say no one will, but, it's all of our jobs. And so if it's my job right now, then I need to do it, and I signed up to do it. And so it's a pleasure to do it on days where you feel like people are listening, and you get those emails that just say, thank you for representing me. Like, I'm so proud to have you my state senator. It's really gratifying to know that you're making people feel like they have someone that cares about them, and they're doing something on their behalf, because everybody needs that little bit of help, It's my hope that can just make someone feel a little better as they go through their day.
Well, I'm glad you're getting those emails, because I know you're not getting sleep. so you, it's at least you have that encouragement at all hours as you try to manage all these different things. I want to ask one last question, which is about your interest in increasing affordable housing and workforce housing. And, I think many of us are concerned about these issues. And again, I think, a majority of Americans, or a plurality of Americans, live in sort of these smaller cities. And so solutions that can work in your communities can work across the country. What do you see as some policies that we should be considering to create housing for the next generation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and definitely the one I have spent the most time on as a public policy person. It's, in my mind, what we see is that businesses are locating where there is talent and where there are employees, and it's not the same economy it was, in the 80s, where you need to provide tax breaks and a race to the bottom. Just look at where Amazon or GE ended up locating. They're going to urban centers where there are young people. And so that kind of aligns in a lovely way with good housing policy. What you want for housing is dense, walkable housing, and that's what's attractive to, our generation. And so that's the most sustainable. It's the most inexpensive or efficient to serve from a municipal perspective. It's the most supportive of creating not just physical but social community. And so thinking about how, either at a local level, which is most often where you can impact it the most. But even at a state level, how you can either require or incentivize, sort of dense mixed use areas in places that make sense for your particular location, I think is just fundamental to moving the needle on it. And so I've done that, for example, by running, it was essentially a 2-year process when I was first a city councilor to do zoning changes in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And then in my next 2 years, I was basically trying to understand whether we could see residential zoning on the converted Air Force Base that's nearby Pease. And I was successful in the first venture. And the second one, we looked into it. We understood there were regulatory changes that involved federal regulations that would probably take 5 or 6 years to fix. But, we're talking about long-term future here. And so that continues to be an interest of mine to sort of see how the use of that Air Force Base will evolve. But, in some ways it is as simple as looking around and figuring out where it makes sense and how can we change the regulations to make that happen. And you won't always build your way to affordability with housing, but in many, many cases, building additional housing supply is something that will affect people of many income brackets, whether that's transitioning out of homelessness into temporary housing, whether that's Section 8 vouchers, whether that's a family, trying to afford their next home or buy a starter home. Increasing housing stock can affect all of those different income ranges, and so it's part of the solution for a lot of different parts of our housing solution.
Yeah, and I think, and you've talked about what it does to make a community more vibrant, right? And so if you can figure out housing, you can figure out so many of these other pieces to make our communities attractive and vibrant places for people to be. I just want to take a second and thank you for your service. I mean, I think you are balancing a lot in a critical state. To many of us, I think we all need to pay attention to New Hampshire politics more than once every 4 years, and having you there is a critical piece. And having you as a new member of the New Deal is exciting.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's been really fun to talk to you, and I hope for anybody who gets to listen that you'll get excited to run for office, because it's just, as I'm sure you can attest to, Ryan, it's a unique experience, but it's the best, and you'll figure it out and enjoy it.
Yes, figure it out and survive some days and thrive others. And absolutely. Well, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you once we get back to a little bit more normalcy in person at the next New Deal conference.
Yeah, I look forward to it, Ryan. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to An Honorable Profession. Please subscribe to hear more amazing leaders, and keep asking your elected officials to be honorable. Boots Road Group produces podcast. I'm Ryan Coonerty, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.